Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today at the launch of UNCTAD's LDC report 2022, the low carbon transition and its daunting implications for structural transformation. We are joined by UNCTAD Secretary General, Ms. Rebeca Grynspan, and by the Director for LDCs in Africa, Mr. Paul Akiwumi. I give the floor first to the Secretary General. Secretary General, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amalia, very much. Thank you all for being here. You know that we are in a very difficult moment. We are bearing the brunt of an unprecedented cascade of crises, a continuing pandemic, aggravating climate change catastrophe, looming debt meltdown, especially for the developing countries, and a global cost of living crisis. And for most LDCs, this is translating into marked increase in malnutrition, destitution, falling behind in terms of development. You know, when you lose in 1 year of crisis more than 1 decade of progress, we are in a very difficult situation, and it also shows that we have no resilience, that maybe what we have called progress was not really so. Yes, that there is you know, a challenge in terms of what we look at, how we measure development. And that's why the Secretary General has been so committed to the GDP plus and the new measurement for development at a global scale. But in the middle of all this, the developing world in general, and at least I have to say least developed countries, and we have a message precisely from the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, they are feeling acutely abandoned, as the Deputy Secretary General said in a recent high-level panel that we hold in the board of UNCTAD. There are no policy responses on the table that come even close to meeting the magnitude of the problem. The LDC report we launched today seeks to address that issue heads-on. Coming just 1 week before COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, this edition of the report has a specific climate focus. But the spirit of this LDC report, which now has over 30 editions in the series, is as always to address global issues from the LDC perspective, a task that is today more important than ever. The report comes with 3 main messages, all addressed towards policymakers meeting at the COP next week. Firstly, LDCs need urgently a green structural transformation to reduce poverty and enhance their resilience to climate risk. So this is not in question. We put it up front. We need a structural transformation that will lead us to sustainable development, because sustainable development is the only development we can think of for the future. We know that LDCs are acutely vulnerable to climate disasters and uniquely dependent on commodities with high CO2 emissions, both. So this is a double negative, yes? It is bad for the planet, but it is especially bad for LDCs because it perpetuates underdevelopment through the commodity dependence trap, something that we have stressed in UNCTAD all the time. So a green structural transformation combines economically, socially, and environmentally responsible growth with rising productivity. So a transition from carbon-intensive sunset sectors to low-carbon sunrise economic activities, promoting the efficient use of resources, materials, energy, land, water, along the development path. We also believe that South-South coordination for a green transition could cut global CO2 emissions below 30 billion tons by the end of the decade and deliver many benefits. That's something that we stressed in our Trade and Development Report in Chapter 3. South-South regional financial safety nets, macroeconomic policy coordination, and trade deals could generate 200 million additional jobs by 2030 and $1.6 trillion annually in additional green investment. But current policies in advanced economies are making it increasingly difficult for developing economies to invest in a green transition. Can I have mine? Where is my bag? Thank you. Sorry. So, as well as strong, and this I say because I have said it several times, we had another increase in interest rates yesterday. Yes? So the possibility of investment going to the south instead of capital flight going to the north is getting more and more difficult for the structural transformation that we need. So, as well as strong South-South cooperation, we need strong multilateral cooperation to address the rising cost of debt servicing and commodities and to deliver required green investments. This report argues that a green structural transformation is a paramount policy objective for LDCs in the current context of cascading crisis. And you know, we have said cascading crises mean cascading inequalities. And LDCs are being impacted especially disproportionately by this cascading crisis. Because as we have been learning the hard way since COVID, when we lost at times over, as I said before, 10 years of progress in human development metrics in the span of 6 months, there is simply no development possible for the future that is not sustainable development. But to achieve this green structural transformation, LDCs need fair treatment, collective action, and immense support. This brings me to second message of this report. LDCs are the litmus test against which history will judge how fairly we addressed the common but differentiated responsibilities principle enshrined in the fight against climate change. LDCs pay, as I said before, a disproportionately high and unfair price in terms of economic, social, and ecological consequences from climate change. The world, 46 LDCs, home to about 1.1 billion people, have contributed minimally to CO2 emissions. In 2019, LDCs accounted for less than 4% of total world greenhouse gas emissions. Yet, over the last 50 years, and this is, a very important a value of the report also, over the last 50 years, 69% of worldwide deaths caused by climate-related disasters occurred in LDCs. This injustice is not being fully addressed by the multilateral system. This is especially the case when it comes to climate finance for adaptation and mitigation. LDCs account for 22% of countries with the most recurring appeal to emergency funds in reaction to extreme weather crises. These risks are aggravated by the failure of developed countries to meet the annual 100 billion goal in climate finance they originally promised to achieve by 2020 to support developing nations to adapt to the climate crisis. Climate adaptation has received far less international support than mitigation, not only in terms of financing, but also in terms of technology development and transfer, capacity development, and technical assistance. Today, we see international investment projects addressing the climate crisis falling in the wake of cascading global crises. So we see that investment in projects, as our investment report said, falling precisely when we need them most. And there was like many years of momentum for international investment projects for climate change, and that momentum has faded as soon as COVID started and as soon as we have had this cost of living crisis. So recent research by UNCTAD suggests that climate investments have fallen by over 10% in just the last 2 quarters alone. At UNCTAD, we urge development partners to extend special and differentiated treatment to LDCs by providing targeted, sufficiently flexible, and long-term finance beyond the commitment to provide ODA corresponding to 0.15 to 0.20% of donors' gross national income for LDCs. Addressing this disproportionality also means ensuring LDC's legitimate claim of priority use of the remaining carbon budget of the Earth. LDCs should not be required to do it first or at the same time as other countries. Rather, they should be allowed longer transition periods to make use of these resources in pursuit of their development right, which is enshrined in the UNFCCC. Our third and final message is that climate-related policies and regulations must explicitly consider LDCs to avoid producing unintended harm. 4/5 of LDCs are classified as commodity dependent, meaning more than 60% of their merchandise exports consist of primary products. Many of these commodities, as I said before, entail high CO2 emissions. That has to change, but the right conditions for that change have to be provided. Also, these commodities are often inputs to carbon-intensive global value chains, including metal, cement, fertilizers, electricity. In all, more than 2/3 of LDCs have economies that depend directly on the export of high carbon-emitting commodities. Our report therefore warns that if LDCs lack the financial resources and the technological avenues for this transition, for decarbonization, the challenges that they face will not be overcome. This is not only true in terms of their economic structures, but also in terms of their capacity to comply with trading partner policies, including carbon pricing and other forms of climate-related regulation. LDCs often lack the institutional capacity to deal with the implications of these regulations, which have risen 15-fold in the last 10 years. So this spaghetti ball of climate regulations is really impossible to follow for most of the LDCs. Because of this, our report also warns against the risk that LDCs become carbon havens. We don't want that. That do the dirty production that other more advanced economies stamp out of their countries. We need to avoid this path. Offshoring pollution is not eliminating pollution, and we are very aware of this. So, dear friends, we are 3 days away from the start of the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. This is a key moment, and the messaging coming out of the Secretary General are very strong and very clear with respect to the path that the world has to take to avoid a catastrophe. And we are seeing this, Paul, very much today with the food crisis. Drought and climate change has been a very important factor of the supply constraints that we are facing, and a lot of it in sub-Saharan Africa and in LDCs. So I really hope that this report helps policymakers make LDCs central to the discussions starting next week. A focus on LDCs and their needs in their development path for the future to be able to make a green structural change is key in the discussions that we will hear next week. I really look forward for your comments and questions, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. I now give the floor to Mr. Paul Akiwumi, Director, Division for Africa, Least Developed Countries and Special Programs of UNCTAD. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Secretary General. I don't think I have too much to add, but I'd like to emphasize a few points that the Secretary General made about this report. I think it's important that we believe that this report will make a powerful case, and does make a powerful case, that there is a need for a focus on green structural transformation during these debates that are happening on climate, specifically with regard to LDCs. As the Secretary General mentioned, least developed countries are commodity dependent, and there is a risk that they will be further entrenched into that commodity dependence, trying to deal with all these regulatory processes. The Secretary General mentioned that, the platitude of regulatory processes. Since 2009 to 2020, 2009 there were roughly 300 environmental regulatory processes. Now there are over 3,500 that LDCs have to follow. But it's important also to note that because of LDCs being able to transform their economies, they must diversify their economies to be able to export. So it is often the case that these environmental regulatory processes come through trade policies. And that's why it's critical that LDCs are considered and that the impact of these trade policies to curb CO2 emissions are considered in light of what LDCs have to go through. The second point I'd like to make is also the fact about that there is a need for everybody to realize that, that countries will transition at different speeds, especially least developed countries. And in that light, as the Secretary General mentioned, it is important that there is international support, not just a fund and not just dealing with projects, but there is a support to assist governments, LDC governments, to work hand in hand with them over a long period, sustained time. Because it is quite clear that there is no guarantee that FDI will continue in these carbon-intensive activities, industries that are going on right now in LDCs till the end of their economic life. And there is also no guarantee that there will be reinvestment in alternative areas of the economies of LDCs. So it's very important that LDCs have the capacity to transform their economies, to move towards structural transformation, but also, more importantly, to move towards green structural transformation, that the activities of their economies are emitting low carbon outputs. Lastly, I would just like to say that one of the key elements which the Secretary General mentioned at the end is the institutional capacities of the countries to deal with all these regulatory frameworks. When you often talk about adaptation, mitigation, funding for that, nobody focuses on the ability of the country to be able to manage all these rules and regulations, first to understand them, then to also practice them, but also to also keep track of all this and to have the database systems and everything there, because they will have to monitor the inputs of sources into products they're producing to be able to export them. Secondly, it's not just about the government institution, it's about the private sector that drives economies. They don't have the capacity either to be able to work out all these new regulatory frameworks and also to be able to implement them. So it's very important that part of the international community support is also focused very much on that, how they can help them for a sustained period of time so that they are conversant with all the rules, regulations that they need to comply to. On that note, Secretary General, I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.